Okay, so we need to take a look at how do we know what a hyperbola looks like in equation form, and also how to figure out which way it's going to go. So first and foremost, we need to identify the horizontal transverse axis versus a vertical transverse axis, all right? A horizontal transverse axis will look like this, where the hyperbola goes off to the left and off to the right. So that's what the graph will look like when there is a horizontal transverse axis. So the axis itself is right here. That's the horizontal transverse axis. Now, what will that equation look like? The equation will be x squared over a squared minus y squared over b squared is equal to 1. Okay. All right. And then also, when it comes to the asymptotes, we can figure out what the slopes are. Now, one's positive, one's negative. Now, slope, in general, is change in y over change in x. It's rise over run. So change in y over change in x. Well, when we take a look here, here's our y. Underneath the y is the b squared. So the change in y is related to b. So I do b over. Change in y is going to be the b. And then when I take a look at the x, change in x is over the a. So that means the change in x is a, all right? So the asymptotes are change in y over change in x. So whatever's under the y, that's the change, helps me find the change in y. Whatever's under the x helps me find the change in x. But we use the a and the b and not the a squared and the b squared, okay? So that's a horizontal transverse. Now, what if we have a vertical transverse, okay? A vertical transverse looks like our opening graph, where I have one branch going up, one branch going down, okay? The difference here is this will be y squared over a squared, the y comes first, minus x squared over b squared equal to 1, okay? And those slopes, again, one positive, one negative. Underneath the y is the a this time. So it's going to be change in y, change in y is related to the a, my apologies. Change in x, under the x is the b squared, so under the x is the b, okay? So we can see that they are the reciprocals from one to the other. And I forgot to highlight the transverse axis here. The transverse axis is this line segment right there, okay? Now, some important things to note here, all right? An important thing to note here. A is always under the first term. A is always under the first term. It's actually the a squared is under the first term, okay? Which means it's not always the largest number. So, and is not always the larger number. Okay. A is always the first denominator when we're looking at a hyperbola. And we know it's a hyperbola because we see subtraction in the equation. Now, what's going to tell us if it's vertical or horizontal? Vertical or horizontal is determined by which letter comes first. X came first, so that's why it's horizontal. Okay, X is first. And then here, Y is first, is what makes it vertical. So Y is first. Okay, so whatever comes before the subtraction sign, whatever the first term is, that's what determines if it's horizontal or vertical transverse axis. Okay? All right, so next up we're going to have one video for each of our 6 examples on how to graph and write equations. All right, here we go.